Hi, everyone. How are you? Are you doing well? I'm glad. I'm very glad. My name is John Michael Bailey, and welcome to the Wellspring Digital Chat Series, where, we sit down, we have a little fireside chat with some of marketing's best brains, and we dive into those brains, we swim around a little bit, uh, you know, get some knowledge, gather some knowledge, put it in a little basket. We go back up on the shore and we have a nice picnic. I have no idea what I'm talking about. So anyway, when I first met Michael, it was when Jim Boykin from Internet Marketing Ninjas paid way too much money for a bunch of marketing speakers to go and eat some amazing food in Philly. And Michael's fish recommendation was absolutely on point. If you ever have a chance to have a meal with him, listen to what he says and get what he tells you to get. So, oh yeah, and he's also a brilliant marketer and speaker. So, Michael, welcome. Please take a moment to introduce yourself to these fine folks.
Well, thanks for having me, John. It's a pleasure to be here. I help agencies and marketing teams do better work through ensuring they have the right teams and those teams are tackling the right challenges. And for the past 2 or so years, I've been doing that work with brands like MeUndies, Ithaca College, Charter School Capital, Aptian, The Good Patch, and Haas Avocado Board, amongst others.
If you've listened to seemingly any podcast these days, you've probably heard of MeUndies because they advertise on seems like all of them. So
Everywhere.
yeah, everywhere. Well, I made the mistake of following Michael at a conference once, kind of like following a stand-up who just completely murdered the audience, and it was rough. So in other words, if you get a chance to see Michael speak, I highly recommend it. But the good news today is that all I have to do is just ask him some questions. So I got it easy. So you ready? You ready to do this?
Let's do it. Let's go.
Let's jump in. So, as mentioned, you are a road warrior who has spoken at numerous marketing conferences. So, quick question in this, assuming we're in a pandemic reality, I'd love to hear your take on the state of marketing conferences post pandemic. Are they better? Are they worse? Are they different? What are your experiences?
I think through the past year or so, I've gone through probably each one of those adjectives in describing
Yeah, right.
conferences. Some of them are better, some of them are worse, some of them are very different. It feels like we are still figuring out what the conference format looks like
Mm,
in any number of ways, not just as an attendee, but as the conference managers themselves are figuring out, what sort of balance between hybrid, virtual, and in person, what's the right balance of experience to bring into each one of those domains, right? In order to give attendees the value that they're paying for. And it feels like we're still figuring it out. And then for the attendee side, I think it is uniquely different. I think you have different brands in the room, different types of individuals in the room. Certainly, the big enterprise sized organizations are not traveling to conferences yet, marketing conferences, I should say. I think in other domains and other parts of their organization, they are traveling, but it feels like marketers at large organizations are not either attending conferences at the moment or choosing to attend them virtually. So the distribution of the type of marketer that's in the room feels a bit different.
mm,
So yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I do think that this past 6 or so months has been uniquely different. I say that in that I was fortunate enough to travel, I would say early in the post quarantine,
right.
people getting vaccinated, sort of feeling better to be in person period. And those were definitely challenging moments for conferences in terms of how comfortable people felt being around each other. And that definitely changes the dynamic of a conference. But in the last 6 or so months, I will say the two biggest conferences I've been to have felt good and warm and a place of solitude and learning and energy that wasn't there before. So it feels like we're headed in the right direction. And I'm hopeful that next year, everywhere that I get the chance to either go speak or attend, I'll feel that way.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it seems to me like I'm always looking for the silver lining. And so the pandemic to me seems as if it's sort of forced these marketing conference people to look inward and see what they're doing, look at what they're doing, assess the value, reformat, rejigger the setup and whatnot. So, in my opinion, I think the the folks who will benefit from this are the attendees. I hope.
Yeah, I do too. I think the other thing that will be interesting to watch is the attendee experience has to be second to none.
Yeah.
There's no excuses for incredible experiences moving forward. And I think that'll be challenging for some conferences, and where it'll allow those conferences that have got the individuals in the room who are thinking through those experiences and
Mhm.
crafting those experiences in nuanced ways. I think they'll bubble up and probably we'll probably end up seeing a shakeout of what conferences survive and those that don't, and it'll all center around attendee experience, and largely their ability to carry their audience, hopefully through the last 2 or 3 years, and then get them back in the room. And it's going to be very different. I think we're going to see probably for the next few years more sponsors on stages than
Mm,
probably have been in years past, because conferences have got to monetize themselves and have got
right.
to drive profit and, well, revenue top end, and then drive profit on the bottom end more than they ever have done before. And that will hopefully not degrade the attendee experience, but there's going to have to be a healthy balance, because having been at conferences too many times probably to share here, that's healthy. I will say that usually, and this is not always the case, but usually the speakers that are coming from sponsors tend to provide content that I think is, let's say, arguably less slanted or more slanted in their favor than someone that's coming to teach and help people learn and give an objective opinion about, whatever tactic they're speaking about.
I agree, and I think we'll just leave it at that. Uh, so what I really wanted to talk to you most about here is email. So when a company is putting together a new email newsletter, you've worked with companies across the board on email marketing. So I'd love to hear your advice to a company that's putting together an email newsletter. They've never done it before, and what would you recommend be their first step? What would your recommended process be?
Yeah, I think the arguably the first step is to go find out what's missing in the industry or the vertical or amongst the audience you're trying to have a conversation with. Like, what is the interesting POV that you're going to bring to that conversation? Perhaps maybe that is not necessarily a point of view, but maybe it's a format choice. Like, there's
Mm,
no text-based or short form content newsletters that are in your space, and that's where you're going to fit in, right? You're going to present the information that may be arguably exactly the same as a competitor or someone else in a unique and different way. And then I think your next step, and these are like 1A and 1B, they go tandem, is figure out that tone of voice and the voice of the brand if you have not. Because if it is not unique, it is not differentiated, if it doesn't make your brand and or your individual brand or your organization's brand distinct in the marketplace, it's just going to get lost in the inbox. So the first thing is
mhm.
figure out, like, what's the unique difference between yours and someone else's, and then what's that voice that you bring into the inbox. I'll give you a couple key examples that I think of individuals that have done this really well, or brands that have done this really well.
Sure.
On the thought leader side, you look at people like Dan Oshinsky, who is a email strategist that's worked largely with big publishers. He presents his newsletter in a Google Doc format. So it's a short form introduction to what's happening this month as it relates to email and in the news business and the publication business. And then the resources in his commentary are on a Google Doc. That's different than anybody else has done
Yeah, I've
in
not
our
seen
space
that.
before. The classic example is probably one of our shared friends or acquaintances, and that's Ann Hanley, right?
Yep.
Total Anarchy, probably the best, I think, voice in the inbox when you consider any number of thought leaders that are in marketing or whatever, name XYZ industry, right? The individual, the person you're hearing inside of the inbox is Ann. On the brand side, you look at places like Sticker Mule, stickermule.com, if you're not familiar, sort of a small swag shop, say that 5 times fast. based out of Colorado, I think, and they decided that their email campaigns were going to be all text-based, 1 to 2 sentences at most. Their friendly from is going to come from a founder or someone inside the organization that you're likely going to bump into if you're a customer of theirs. And so it makes it very easy to interact, right? You can open those emails and know you're going to spend 1 to 1.5 seconds digesting the content, and then you can
Right.
move. You can make a buying decision or move on. So there's just, I think, again, you have to go back to what's missing in amongst the audience that is going to be hopefully is tuning into your newsletter. And then 2, how do you do it, either voice or context or utility or format, in a way that resonates? And that's a real challenge because there's just a lot of noise in the inbox right now.
Yeah. So, I mean, aside from, putting together a newsletter that looks and feels and sounds like everybody else, what are some other common mistakes that you're seeing in other companies' email marketing? Maybe some emails that you've gotten, what are they doing wrong, and what do you think the alternative or solution is?
I think you have to think about their technical setup, and I know this is probably going to go over the heads of marketers who may not have a technical background, but you've got to ensure, you've got to ensure that your authentication records are in place. You're leveraging an ESP that is doing everything it can to make sure your emails are getting into the inbox, because if they aren't, why are you even putting the effort in to create this community inside the inbox for your customers or your advocates? It's all for naught if it's not getting delivered. And there are very specific things that you could do as a brand to make sure you're getting delivered. So it's like the basics from a technical perspective. I think we are also, we need to be very careful with volume. And I say that as someone who has worked with brands that are sending email campaigns every single day, and they have a right to be there because a significant amount of their subscribers are willing to open that brand's email campaign every single day. But there's a lot of brands that are out there that are playing the volume game because somehow we got into this conversation of more email equals better XYZ data point at some point.
Right.
And I'm not going to get into who started that conversation first, but it led to this plethora of volume. And yeah, volume does work. But when you look on the deliverability side of the house, what we know is that engagement is being measured by very specific actions that your subscribers take. On the positive side, it's things like clicks. It's somewhat open rate these days, although that's a very muddy place to be.
Yeah.
It's replies, and it's foldering or archiving a campaign. Those are the most positive things you can do from an engagement perspective that tell the ISP, the internet service providers, that you as a subscriber care about that brand. In the middle, this fuzzy middle place, surprisingly, over the last 2 or 3 years, we've learned that an unsubscribe is sort of a fuzzy middle place. It's not so much a negative. It's not so much a negative impact. Doesn't have such a big negative impact on engagement rates. And then on the very negative impact side, so think of that red light, if you will, unengaged subscribers and mark as spam are probably just as detrimental to the engagement rates on your campaigns. And so what that tells me is that as a strategist, you have to be diligent of ensuring that the volume that you're sending through equates to the attention that you're getting. Because if your unengaged subscribers are continuing to grow and you're only hitting averages, you're actually not only just doing those unengaged subscribers a disservice, but you're doing a disservice to your long-term deliverability of your campaigns in the future. And so I think those are the two big things. It's making sure you've got the technical setup in place, and then being really, really diligent about ensuring that when the content does drop, you have engaged subscribers, and that you're working really, really hard to trim off those unengaged subscribers as quickly as possible, because it's going to help your campaigns in the long term.
And I'm glad you got technical, because I feel like, at least for smaller businesses, they don't really take into account the email deliverability, and they don't think about those things on the technical side that really make a huge difference. I mean, you could set up your email and campaign in MailChimp and shoot it out and be like, I'm not getting anything out of this. And it could be because no one's getting your email.
Yeah, very much so.
You mentioned the newsletter where he's linking to a Google Doc, which I think is really a great idea. I'm wondering, what are some other brands that are innovating in email marketing today? Like what other, risks are they taking? What other new things are they trying that people should know about?
So probably two things, and I wouldn't say these are like new or risky, but they're certainly they require more resources, both
Hmm.
individual resources and I think technical resources and time and energy to think about how you execute these things. Dynamic content, right? So this idea of that you format a template for your entire audience, and then there are certain components that are split out and injected with content, whether it's a headline image or body copy based on a data point that you've got that's very different subscriber to subscriber.
Hmm.
So, essentially think like an easy one would be geolocation. So, a shipping address of a customer, you're going to target them with a very specific, like maybe seasonal offer, or you're going to show them where they could go interact with your brand offline, like the nearest store where they could buy it or something like that. So, it's certainly harder. It's harder to scale. You have to have any number of things in place. You have to have asked the data. The data's got to make sure that you've got essentially clean data inside your
Yeah.
subscriber database or your CDP, right? Your customer database platform, and it becomes uniquely harder to scale those efforts if you have two of those challenges happening at the same time, which is you're not collecting robust, clean data, and certainly you're not cleaning out that data as you have customers that tell you other things about their buying profiles and their demographics, right? So certainly one thing. I think the other thing that you're seeing a lot of brands certainly try is things like interactive components on campaigns, right? You look at the AMP platform from the team over at Gmail, as well as what you're seeing from other teams around interactive components. And it certainly takes more technical knowledge, and you have to be willing to certainly, customize those campaigns and code them to a way that degrades, across different devices, because that's not going to work on every single platform.
Right.
But it can have really interesting impacts, like the ability to select products inside of the inbox, and then it's a one-click buy from that campaign, or do drop downs, or potentially serve in real-time content. So I think those are probably like the two riskiest and interesting things that are happening. I think probably the better thing that we should be focused on as brands is like, are we just doing the basics really, really well? Because that tends to work well in the inbox, right?
Hmm.
And you see that happen with brands like Sticker Mule and some of the others that I've named. When you just continue to deliver value and continue to show up as the brand that you are. There's a great little brand out of Europe called Hardgraft. It's a small manufacturer of leather goods like bags and purses and passport covers and things like that. I think they're sort of building into an entire fashion empire eventually, but they just do their voice inside of the inbox is just so nuanced and unique, and that's their point of differentiation, right? Their email campaign could look just exactly the same as some other leather goods manufacturer, but you open it and the words that are used and the way that they describe products and their headlines are a wee bit different, and they take it all the way to like a cart abandonment email, which normally is just like, hey, get 20% off.
Yeah.
And they ask you, hey, is there anything that's stopping you from making this purchase? Do you have any questions? Here are our founders. You can email them directly if you've got questions about the product, which is something no one else is doing, right? So sometimes, like, I think the basics are just where we need to get back to ensure that we can build a strong foundation as we grow our organizations and our brands.
I mean, that's great advice because the vast majority of people, well, I won't say that, but many times people will seem to get distracted by the shiny object instead of focusing on what is actually important and what your audience is looking for. As you're describing that brand, I'm thinking of that sketch from Saturday Night Live where they had the leather store. I think it was Jimmy Fallon.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's the problem with my mind. So, I want to dive into, the ubiquitous crystal ball question, but in a slightly different way. You've worked with some very well-known brands recently that you mentioned, and I would love to know what's keeping them up at night. What future trends or challenges are they most concerned with, and how might this translate to smaller organizations? Let's scare the crap out of some people.
I think the easiest, hardest answer here is uncertainty.
Yeah.
The world feels very uncertain right now. for any number of reasons, right? We just came out of a global pandemic. We are seemingly some countries are trying to start a World War III in the middle of Europe.
Just the little things, you know.
Just the little things,
Yeah.
rampant inflation, globalization and the reaction to it, politics, obviously, which we don't need to spend any time on.
I like to call this the good times.
Yes, it's a lot of uncertainty, and the thing is like businesses at the end of the day hate uncertainty,
Yeah.
Particularly large organizations. But then all that trickles down, right? It's uncertainty. The economy does not look like it's headed in a great direction. You know, if you're in Europe right now, you're looking at what is arguably going to be probably the most expensive winter for electricity, and that's going to hit every sector in terms of like where people are going to spend their money. Great Britain is going to publish. I mean, I don't know when this is going to go up, but we're in early Q4 or middle of Q4, I should say, right now, Q3. Great Britain's arguably going to sink into a deep recession over the next 2 years. That is for certain. Where the United States goes, I think, is kind of an odd place, and it could do fine. Like it could just hobble around for 2 years as other economies struggle. But the easy answer and hard answer here is truly uncertainty. And for marketing teams and for marketers, I think when things are uncertain, I think there are a couple key things we have to do. And I actually just had this conversation in a planning session with a team a couple of days ago. One, we have to make sure we're doing the fundamentals really well. Like, let's go back and make sure, we've historically optimized posts that are performing well, that we are looking at our search campaigns and ensuring that the right keywords are being bid for branded and non-branded and our different ad groups, and that we're optimizing them as much as we can. We've got to ensure that the experience when we acquire that customer is as fluid and frictionless as possible, and that we deliver on that brand promise through the entire experience. And that means like working with sales and working with fulfillment to make sure that experience is through. We've got to be, I think, keenly concerned with pricing. And I think this is a place that marketing does not get enough seats at the table when discussing pricing and discussing value and how we optimize pricing for our organizations and for our products and services. And I think we as marketers need to get really okay with uncomfortable questions that we don't understand. Like I have zero finance background. I took like 2 economics classes in college. I have a fairly rudimentary understanding of like fiscally how things work, but you have to be being really uncomfortable in those moments of saying like, hey, going into your CFO's office or going into a group, a perspective, accounting or sales and whatnot, and asking questions that you may not have the answer to, just to understand the impact that it's going to have on the team, and then prepare for this inevitable. Like look back at what happened in our last recession and what performed well, what didn't, what did we learn, how do we utilize those things to be prepared for what's coming down the road. So for me, the answer here is uncertainty, and I think that leads to a lot of questions that we have to ask as marketers, and hopefully be prepared for what may or may not be happening over the next several years.
Yeah, there seems to be this kind of amnesia that happens where they forget all about what they did right and what they did wrong in the last recession, and everybody's hair's on fire, and let's figure it out now. So yeah,
and that's why it's important. Like when you're working on any campaign or your annual plan or quarterly or however you structure your marketing activities as a team, is make sure you give time for those retrospectives. Like after a campaign is done, or you're doing, quarterly, biannual, or annual planning, there's a retrospective time. This is a process or technique that I first got introduced to by the brand team over at Dropbox. Every time they do a campaign and that campaign is done, everyone gets in a room and they have a retrospective time where they answer a couple of key questions about what worked, what didn't, what could we do better? And that content, those learnings get added to the brief for the next campaign, so that those learnings continue. And then hopefully as you make this part of your process, on a regular basis, you're doing these retrospectives at these moments where the economy is going in different places. You could pull up those campaigns and retrospectives and sort of look at like, hey, this is what worked back then, right? And I think, obviously, I'm sure everyone's going to go like, but the context is different, and historically we're in a different place. I'm like, I totally get it. You've got to put the lens of where we are right now on the conversation.
But historical data still has value.
It does. It really does. So, make retrospectives, postmortems, whatever you want to call them, a part of your planning process or a part of that campaign process, or give your teams the moments to look back and say, hey, this is what worked, this is what didn't work, so that you can bake that into future campaigns and future opportunities as a marketing team.
I love the term retrospective as is just a terrible way to describe a review of something that may have gone well.
Yeah.
So,
Yes. Yeah.
uh, well, Michael, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And I got to be honest, there's a lot more here than I was expecting, but at the same time, I was expecting a lot from you. So I'm surprised pleasantly, and this was really good stuff. So I really appreciate it. There's a lot of great stuff here.
My pleasure. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, absolutely. Bye, everybody.